After paying for an elderly woman's groceries in the store, she leaned in and whispered something so strange that I almost laughed it off. "When your husband leaves the house tonight, don't touch the snow in the yard." I brushed the comment aside with a quiet chuckle, and yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, I still decided to listen, and didn't clear the walkway. And the next morning, when I stepped out onto the porch, I stood frozen at what lay before me. I was standing in line at the checkout counter of a grocery store on Kinsman Road, clutching my worn cloth bag tightly against my chest. Outside the glass windows, a snowstorm was sweeping through the streets of Cleveland, wind howling, snow whitening the entire sky. This December had been especially brutal, with heavier and more relentless snowfall than usual. 58 years old, the age when you no longer run from supermarket to supermarket chasing discounts. You just go to the familiar store near home where the cashiers recognize your face, know your name, and even remember what kind of coffee you usually buy. Right in front of me, a frail elderly woman was struggling at the counter. She poured a handful of loose coins from a tattered wallet onto the surface, trembling as she counted each one with fingers that were calloused and flushed red from the cold. On the conveyor belt were only the barest essentials, painfully so: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, 3 potatoes, and a single small onion. "You're short," said Jada, the young cashier with tired eyes, her voice flat. "About $1. "How can that be, dear?" the old woman murmured in confusion, bending down to search through the coins again. "I counted them at home. I counted very carefully." Behind me, someone sighed in irritation. The line grew longer, and in weather like this, everyone just wanted to get home as fast as possible. I looked at the woman, her small frame, slightly hunched back, hands reddened by the cold, the pitifully cheap groceries, and something tightened in my chest. How many times had I walked past other people's hardship, pretending not to see? How many times had I turned away to avoid confronting someone else's need? But today, something was different. "Jada, add it to my total," I said, slipping a $20 bill past the woman's shoulder. "I'll pay." "Oh, no, dear, that's really not necessary." The old woman turned to me, flustered and alarmed. "I can put something back." "It's fine," I smiled, keeping my voice gentle. "It's nothing, really." She looked up at me, and in that instant I shivered without meaning to. Her eyes were not old. They were clear and deep, as if they were seeing straight through me, through the shell I'd been wearing for years. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her body fragile, but in her gaze there was something powerful, an ancient, seasoned wisdom, difficult to name. "Thank you, child," she said as she packed her items into a faded, checkered bag. Her voice trembled, but it was steady. "Your kindness will not be forgotten. It will come back to you." I only shrugged and paid for my own groceries. Chicken for stew, vegetables, bread, a few cans. Lionel was leaving tonight for a long haul. 1 week, sometimes 10 days. I needed to cook ahead for him to take along and stock up enough for the days I'd be alone. 32 years of marriage, 32 years of seeing him off, waiting for him to return, cooking, washing, cleaning. Life moved along a familiar groove, so steady it no longer required thought. I had just lifted my bags to leave when I suddenly felt the sleeve of my old coat being grabbed, hard. The old woman was right beside me. Her sinewy fingers clenched my sleeve with surprising strength, so much so that I couldn't pull away immediately. "Listen carefully," she whispered, leaning in close. I could feel her breath. She smelled of camphor, dried herbs, and something else. Old, ancient, hard to define. "When your husband leaves the house tonight, don't touch the snow in the yard, do you hear me?" Her voice dropped lower. "No matter what he tells you, don't clear it. Wait until the next morning. Let the white snow stay exactly as it is." "What?" I blinked, confused. "Snow? What are you talking about?" "Don't touch the snow until morning," she repeated slowly, deliberately, as if hammering the words into my head. Her fingers tightened, almost painfully. "Promise me. This is very important." Your life depends on it. Trust an old woman." "Yes, okay. I answered mechanically, finally pulling my arm free and stepping back. My heart was pounding, unease spreading through my body. That gaze, intense, grave, almost hypnotic, sent a chill down my spine. "I won't clear it," I said. "I promise." She released my sleeve, nodded slowly as if satisfied, and turned away. She walked quickly, strangely fast for her age, and in the blink of an eye, she vanished into the swirling snow beyond the glass doors. I stood there watching, then shook my head to dispel the strange feeling clinging to me. She was probably not all there anymore. A poor, lonely old woman living in her own world. Sometimes the mind gets confused, clinging to superstitions. Perhaps hardship and isolation had driven her to say such odd things. Outside, the snowstorm hit me immediately. I flinched as icy flakes slapped my face. I hunched over, wrapped my old scarf tightly around my neck, and hurried toward the bus stop where a group of people stood shivering. Lionel and I lived in the suburbs of Cleveland, in a quiet neighborhood in Glenville, where houses sat apart on wide plots of land. Our home had once belonged to my parents, an old but sturdy house with thick walls built in the 70s. I had been the mistress of that house for many years. I revived the neglected garden, planted apple trees that now bore fruit every summer, tended the flower beds, roses near the porch, carnations lining the walkway. 32 years of marriage, and nearly 30 of them spent in that very house. To me, it was home. The bus was packed, reeking of wet wool and damp clothing. I squeezed toward a window, rested my forehead against the icy glass, and thought again of the old woman's words. "Don't touch the snow." How strange. That morning, while rushing through breakfast before leaving, Lionel had grumbled that the driveway needed to be cleared immediately, that the snow had piled too high, completely burying it. He ordered me to take care of it tonight, or he wouldn't be able to back the truck out. And now a strange old woman had whispered bizarre warnings about snow in the yard. A ridiculous coincidence. Nothing more. The house greeted me with dark windows and a deep, penetrating cold. Lionel had left early for the depot to prepare the truck, and he hadn't turned on the heat. I stepped inside, knocked the snow from my boots onto the mat, peeled off my wet coat, crossed the cold floor to the kitchen, turned up the thermostat, set the kettle on the stove, and began putting away groceries. Vegetables into the pantry, chicken into the fridge, bread into its box. Every movement was familiar, automatic after so many years. The house slowly warmed. The radiators clanked comfortingly. The kettle began to whistle. Lionel would be home at 6 to pick up his things and food for the trip. I started cooking as usual, washing and cutting the chicken, simmering a rich broth, chopping vegetables for the salad he liked, pulling out the meatballs I'd prepared the week before from the freezer. He always said roadside food was full of chemicals and filth. At exactly 6, the front door burst open. Cold air flooded the house with Lionel. He came in heavily, shaking snow from his coat right onto the floor, not caring about the puddle. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered face, cold gray eyes. 59 years old, still solid despite more than 25 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. "Is everything ready?" he asked instead of greeting me, not looking up as he walked straight into the kitchen. "Yes, Lionel, I'm packing it now," I replied. He sat at the table, poured tea from the old ceramic kettle, added 3 spoonfuls of sugar, then buried his face in his phone, typing nonstop. Not a glance in my direction. I stole a look at that familiar face. When had the distance between us grown so cold? 1 year, 2, 5? Or had it already been 10? Before, he used to return from long trips, tired but cheerful, hug me at the door, tell stories from the road, laugh. Now there was only silence and irritation in every movement, every glance, as if I were not his wife, but an inconvenient servant. "You need to clear the snow tonight," Lionel said, eyes still glued to his phone. "The driveway's completely buried." "It'll be worse by morning." Lionel, it's getting dark, and the storm is really bad, I began, but stopped when he looked up, eyes icy. I said tonight, he cut in. You're not a child. Half an hour, that's all. I don't have time. Tomorrow's trip is important. I pressed my lips together and continued silently packing the food into the large travel bag. The old woman's words echoed in my head. When your husband leaves tonight, don't touch the snow. An impossible coincidence. But then again, it was winter. When wasn't there snow to shovel? When are you leaving? I asked quietly. About an hour. Cargo's sealed, paperwork's done. He drained the now cold tea in one gulp and stood. I'll shower, grab my things, then go. He went upstairs. I stayed alone in the kitchen, slowly eating a bowl of lukewarm soup I'd made that morning. Outside the window, the wind howled, snow falling without pause. I drew the curtain and looked into the yard. The lone street lamp by the gate barely pierced the thick curtain of snow. The driveway had almost completely disappeared beneath a white layer nearly knee-high. About 40 minutes later, Lionel came down with his bag over his shoulder. I handed him the carefully packed food. You'll call when you arrive, right? I asked, though I knew he rarely did. Yeah, he answered curtly without looking at me. No goodbye kiss, just a nod. Don't forget the snow, he added before stepping out. Otherwise, you won't even be able to get outside tomorrow. The door slammed shut. I heard his old pickup start and pull away, the sound gradually swallowed by the snowfall. I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapped my hands around the now cold tea. The house was silent, hollow. And inside me, a nameless unease began to rise. Don't touch the snow. I shook my head. Superstitious nonsense. And yet something held me back, stopping me from putting on warm clothes and going out to shovel as Lionel had ordered. Exhaustion washed over me. A long, draining day. My back ached, my legs were sore, and in a storm like this, even if I cleared it now, it would be covered again by morning. What was the point? I decided to wait until morning. Lionel was already gone. He wouldn't know, and if he did, I'd blame the weather. I went up to the bedroom, changed into an old nightgown, slipped on a robe, lay down with the book I'd been reading, but I couldn't read. The words slid past without sinking in. All I could see was the strange old woman, her piercing eyes, her grave warning. Outside, the wind continued to howl. The house creaked. I got up and looked out the window. The yard was swallowed by dense darkness. Only the weak yellow light by the gate pulled shapes from the swirling snow. Everything, the gate, the porch, the rose bushes, was buried beneath a blanket of white. A strange anxiety clenched my chest, as if tonight something had to happen. Something important. Something unavoidable. I returned to bed, pulled the blanket up to my chin, listened to the winter wind screaming outside, and could not shake the growing dread tightening around my heart. If, that night, I had listened to Lionel and cleared the snow, then by morning, not a single trace would have remained. In the next part, just one detail in that layer of snow would expose a truth that sent my life down an entirely different path. The old clock on the nightstand ticked steadily. The hands pointed to exactly 11 at night. Lionel must have already gotten far from here. I pictured him driving on a snow-covered highway in the dark, the radio turned low, sipping strong coffee from his thermos, letting his mind drift wherever it wanted. What has he been thinking lately? I wondered, and then felt strangely sad that I even had to ask. We had barely spoken in recent months. Or maybe I should call it years. Lionel came home and stayed silent, slept off the exhaustion of the trip, ate a quick meal without bothering to lift his eyes. Then packed his things again and left again. We lived like two strangers under the same roof, bound only by a marriage certificate tucked somewhere in a drawer. When exactly did everything become like this? I tried to rearrange my memories, like flipping through the pages of an old, crumpled notebook. Maybe it all started when we realized we couldn't have children. But that was so long ago, right in the early years of our marriage, more than 30 years ago. Back then, Lionel was still gentle, still able to hold me and say the right things, that we could still live well with just the two of us, that happiness wasn't about whether you had children or not. Or maybe it was after my serious illness 3 years ago, the surgery, then the long recovery that hurt so much it drained me dry. Lionel had become especially distant then, cold, as if I had turned into a burden, or as if he had grown tired of me, of the monotonous rhythm, of this old house, of my aging face, of everything. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the heavy thoughts that clung like mud around my feet. Tomorrow will be a new day, I told myself. Maybe everything only felt worse because I was tired, because I was lonely, because winter sadness lingered and wouldn't let go. That was all. I needed to pull myself together and do something useful. When Lionel came back after a week, I would cook something really good. We would sit down and talk normally, in sync again like before. We hadn't truly talked in a long time, but sleep didn't come like a gentle stream. It came in waves, uneasy, broken. I would drift off and then jolt awake to a strong gust of wind, to the window frame creaking like a weary complaint. I dreamed of the old woman at the store. Those piercing eyes as if staring straight into the deepest part of me, those dry, sinewy fingers gripping my sleeve, and her voice, repeating in the dream like a chant, "Don't touch the snow. Don't touch the snow. Don't touch the snow." I woke early while it was still dark. The clock read close to 6 in the morning. Outside the window, the sky had only just opened into a thin seam of light, like a thread. And the strangest thing was, the storm had completely stopped. The silence outside wasn't normal silence. It was thick, heavy, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I sat up, pulled a warm wool robe over my shoulders, and went down to the kitchen. Everything in me moved on habit. Set the kettle on the stove, light the burner, walk to the window, and I froze. The yard was covered in smooth white snow, untouched, like a sheet no one had disturbed. But from the gate straight toward the house, toward the first-floor windows, there were footprints, very clear, very deep. Footprints of a man, heavy, large boot prints, and I knew for certain they weren't Lionel's. I knew Lionel's shoes. I knew his shoe size. I knew the way he walked, but these were unfamiliar prints, bold, deep, with a wide stride, like someone tall, heavy, and unhurried. Someone had come to our house in the night, walked around the yard, come close to the windows. While I was here alone, I stood rigid at the window, my hand gripping the sill until my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding too hard, too fast, to the point I felt it might leap out of my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off those footprints, as if staring long enough would make me understand what had happened. The prints led from the gate straight to the house, then circled around both sides. They stopped at every ground floor window, as if the person had paused, looked inside, observed carefully. Someone had walked around my house while I slept, alone, with no way to defend myself. I stumbled backward, covering my mouth to stifle a sob. My breathing turned fast and shallow. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt hard to swallow, hard to breathe. I had to stay calm. I had to think clearly. Could it be a neighbor? No, it couldn't. The house on the left belonged to the Petersons, both over 70. Footprints this deep and heavy couldn't be theirs. The lot on the right had been empty for a year now. The owners had moved out, the house sealed shut. Across the street lived only Bernice Halstead, alone. But why would an older woman walk around someone else's yard in a snowstorm, in the middle of the night? I forced myself closer to the glass, looking more carefully. The footprints weren't chaotic. They weren't the steps of someone rushing, panicking. On the contrary, they were deliberate, methodical. From the gate, straight to the living room window. Then along the wall to the kitchen window. Then continuing toward the back of the house, where the pantry and the basement entrance were, as if the person were checking the entire perimeter of the house. looking into every window, studying. Watching, inspecting, testing. A cold current ran down my spine. Goosebumps rose along my arms. A burglar? Someone casing the place? But if it was a thief, why take nothing? Why not force the door? My gate was latched with a simple fastener. The lock was still intact, no damage. The prints only led from the gate into the yard and back out again, which meant the person had opened the gate calmly, walked in, circled the house, then calmly closed the gate and left. No urgency at all. At that moment, the kettle shrieked on the stove. I jumped at the sudden sound. With trembling hands, I shut off the gas. But I had no mind left for tea. I stood there, staring at the snow outside like it was a warning made visible. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? But what would I even say? Someone walked around my yard, but they broke nothing, stole nothing, left nothing but footprints. It sounded like the kind of story that would make someone frown. Then I remembered the patrol officer in our area, Malcolm Price. I had known him for years, since he first started working this neighborhood when he was still young. Now he was past 50, but still diligent and attentive. People always said, if something feels off, call Price. I ran upstairs and hurriedly got dressed, warm sweatpants, a thick sweater, trading slippers for winter boots. I grabbed my phone and searched for his number in an old contact list. My fingers shook so badly I had to dial twice to get it right. Officer Price, this is Denise Harden on Kinsman Road, number 17. I'm sorry to call so early, but I'm dealing with something very strange. Good morning, Mrs. Harden. His voice was calm, slightly hoarse. What happened? Last night, someone came to my house. They walked around the yard and left footprints in the snow. I'm home alone. My husband just left on a long haul, and I'm very scared. Understood. Is anything missing? Did they force a door? Are the windows intact? No. Everything seems untouched, but the footprints, they lead to the windows, from every side, like someone deliberately looked inside, or was searching for something specific. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, as if he were weighing it. All right, he said. I'm coming right now, 20 to 30 minutes at most. Don't go outside, and do not step on the footprints under any circumstances. Check all the windows and doors carefully. Make sure everything is locked tight. Thank you, I exhaled, as if I'd just been allowed to breathe. I'll wait for you. I set the phone down and immediately began checking the house, but the feeling inside me didn't ease at all. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, like something that had sheltered me my whole life had developed a crack. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound outside made me snap my head around. I went through every first-floor room, carefully checking each window. All of them were shut tight. No sign of prying. The front door was still locked with both deadbolts and the chain, exactly as I had done the night before I went to bed. Everything was perfect. And strangely, that did not reassure me. It only made me more afraid. I found myself pulled back to the kitchen window as if by a magnet. In the clearer morning light, the footprints looked even sharper, heavy, intimidating, terrifying, very large, very deep. The distance between steps was wide. Definitely a man, tall, heavy, broad-built. And he walked slowly, confidently, calmly, as if he knew exactly what he was doing and knew exactly that I was inside alone. The 20-minute wait stretched like hours. I sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea that had gone ice cold, my eyes glued to the window. What if he came back? What if he was standing somewhere out there watching, waiting for me to step outside, waiting for the moment my attention slipped? Then, finally, headlights swept across the window. I sprang up. A familiar patrol car stopped in front of the house. Malcolm Price stepped out. A tall, heavy-set African-American man, a little over 50, wearing a winter uniform jacket and a warm cap. "Officer Price, thank you for coming so quickly." I almost ran to the door and opened it before he could even ring the bell. "It's all right, Mrs. Harden. It's my job." He knocked the snow from his heavy boots and followed me into the kitchen. His experienced gaze immediately went to the window, toward the yard. "Show me exactly the footprints." We stepped onto the porch. The cold air burned my face and lungs. Malcolm went down the creaking wooden steps, approached the tracks, crouched, and examined each imprint carefully. "Boots," he murmured. "Size 12, maybe 13. Deep tread. Looks like work boots or combat boots. Came from the gate." He followed the entire chain of prints. From the gate to the living room window, then along the wall past the kitchen, around to the back of the house, then back along a similar path to the gate. Very strange. He stood up, brushing snow from his knees. Who could it be? His voice lowered. I hugged myself inside my old coat, trembling not only from the cold. "Officer, what do you think he came for? Why come at night, then walk around the house?" Malcolm looked at me with a serious expression, heavy as stone. "First tell me, do you have any major conflicts with neighbors? Anyone offended, holding a grudge?" "No." I shook my head immediately. "We live quietly, peacefully. We don't bother anyone. We don't argue with anyone. And your husband," he continued, "exactly when did he leave?" "Last night, around 7. A long haul, at least a week, maybe longer." Malcolm nodded slowly and wrote notes in a small, worn notebook. "So this person knew for sure you'd be home alone." He looked back at the footprints, then spoke as if fitting pieces together, opened the gate calmly, came in calmly, circled methodically, then closed the gate and left. No rush. Very confident. I swallowed hard. "Do you think he was casing the place?" "There are a few possibilities," Malcolm said, his voice even but heavy. "He could be checking for valuables, preparing for a burglary. He could be checking whether anyone's home, whether it's empty, or he could be—" He stopped. But I understood the rest of what he didn't say. He could be preparing for something much worse, not just theft. And as Malcolm stood there, in the middle of a yard covered in pure white snow, I suddenly remembered something that had seemed small, the old woman's words at the grocery store. "When your husband leaves the house tonight, don't touch the snow." If I had listened to Lionel and cleared everything last night, then this morning the yard would have been slick, messy, nothing left to see, no footprints. No evidence, no reason to call the police. I looked at that untouched snow, and for the first time in my life, a thought made my skin crawl. The old woman had not been speaking nonsense. She was saving me, in a way I still couldn't understand. "Do any of your neighbors have security cameras?" Officer Price asked in a professional tone, his eyes sweeping across the neighboring houses as if drawing a map in his head. I strained to remember. Bernice Halstead across the street. I think she does. She had a system installed last year after the Petersons' shed was broken into. "Great." Price nodded immediately. "A camera can help a lot. We'll go over there right now, ask to see the recording. It might have captured who the person was, what they drove, and when they came." We left my porch and crossed the empty road blanketed in thick snow. The wind bit at my face, but the cold inside me was sharper. Mrs. Halstead's house sat directly opposite, neat and carefully maintained, painted a soft pale blue with beautiful wooden shutters. I rang the bell at the gate. A little over a minute later, the front door swung open. Mrs. Halstead appeared on the porch, a round, kind-looking woman in her 70s, wrapped in a bright floral robe. Her silver hair was neatly pinned into a bun at the back of her head. "Denise, sweetheart, what is it?" "Is something wrong?" She squinted with concern, then looked toward the officer beside me. "Mrs. Bernice, hello?" I tried to keep my voice calm. "Last night, a stranger came into my yard. This morning, there are very clear footprints in the snow." Officer Price came to take a look. "Could I ask you to open your security camera footage for us? Maybe it recorded something important." "Oh, Lord have mercy." Mrs. Halstead lifted a hand to her chest by instinct, genuinely shaken. A stranger walking around your house at night while you're alone, and Lionel's away on a long haul. Oh my God, that's terrifying just to hear. Come in quickly. Of course, we have to look right away. She led us into her living room. It was small but warm, clean, and orderly, filled with sturdy, dark wood furniture in an old-fashioned style. A modern flat-screen TV was mounted on the wall. Beneath it sat a black recording box, green and red lights blinking steadily. Here, it's running. Mrs. Halstead fussed with the remote as she spoke. She seemed confused because there were several remotes. Officer Price, you handle it, please. I don't really understand these things. My grandson installed it. Officer Price nodded and took the remote with confidence. He began fast-forwarding through the footage. I stood close beside him, nearly holding my breath, my eyes glued to the screen, terrified of missing even a second. The camera image was black and white, grainy and blurred by the snow, but you could still clearly see the street in front of Mrs. Halstead's house, and across from it, my house, my yard gate, and part of my yard. You said your husband left around 7 p.m., Price confirmed, never taking his eyes off the screen. Yes, around 7, maybe a little later. He fast-forwarded to close to 8, then switched to normal speed. Outside was a thick curtain of snow, visibility poor. The street was deserted, no one in sight. The timestamp in the corner crawled forward. 9 p.m., 10, 11. Here. Price suddenly spoke, his voice low but sharp. He jabbed a finger straight at the screen. Look closely, 11:44. A strange car appeared at the edge of the frame, a dark-colored sedan that looked very normal, nothing distinctive. It moved slowly, then pulled to a neat stop directly across from my house. A tall man stepped out at an unhurried pace, wearing a thick dark coat and a knit hat pulled low over his forehead. His face couldn't be identified due to the camera quality, the snow, and the darkness. He stood there, looking around as if checking whether anyone was watching. Then he opened my gate naturally, as if it were something he had prepared for, and disappeared inside. "Dear God," I whispered. My insides turned to ice. My legs went weak, like they no longer belonged to me. About 10 minutes later, maybe 12, the man appeared again. He walked out of my yard, calm as before. He latched the gate shut neatly, without the slightest hurry. Then he got into the car, drove away slowly, and vanished around the bend. "Pause," Price ordered, short and firm. He rewound a little, then froze the image at the moment the car was most visible. "That's the license plate," he said, voice steady. "Hard to read because of the snow and darkness, but we might be able to make out a few numbers. And this too." He pointed to the side door of the car. "There's a logo. Lettering, like a company vehicle." I squinted at the screen. Sure enough, there was a bright patch on the door, like a symbol and large text. "Looks like an organization vehicle," Price murmured, almost to himself. "Not a personal car. Could be a company, a legitimate business, or it could be an appraiser from a real estate company." Mrs. Halstead spoke up unexpectedly. She had been standing beside us the whole time, both hands still pressed to her chest. I whipped around, completely confused. "An appraiser? What, Bernice? Why an appraiser?" Mrs. Halstead flinched at my expression. "Oh, I'm not sure," she fumbled. "It's just an association. Maybe someone's planning to sell a house and called for an appraisal." Then she cut herself off, as if realizing she'd just thrown gasoline on a fire. "Oh, Denise, forgive me. I'm an old woman talking nonsense." I might be saying something stupid, but Officer Price didn't let it go. His eyes sharpened immediately, like a bloodhound catching a scent. "Mrs. Halstead, why did real estate come to your mind right away?" Mrs. Halstead swallowed, hesitated a beat, then told the truth. "Just last month, I met an appraiser when I was considering buying an apartment for my daughter in the city. He came late in the evening, too, because he couldn't make it during the day. And he drove exactly the kind of company car with a big, bright logo on the door. At a glance, it looks very similar." Officer Price zoomed in on the car as much as the recording quality allowed. The letters were still blurry because of the distance and snow, but the first word could be read. Hearth. Price read slowly, then immediately wrote it down in his notebook. Hearth, and then something else. He looked at the screen again, as if pinning the image into his memory. We have to check every real estate company in the city and the county. Find out exactly which company has a vehicle with a logo like this. I stood there, unable to speak. Inside my head, a crazy thought spiraled like a storm. Why would an appraiser come to inspect my house at night? Who called them? This house is registered entirely in my name. I have never signed a power of attorney for anyone. I have no plan to sell. This is my only home. But there is one person who knows every corner of this house. Knows where the documents are, knows how to make everything happen smoothly. And that person, last night, ordered me to clear the snow. So this morning the yard wouldn't be pristine. There wouldn't be any footprints left. Lionel, no, that's impossible. My heart slammed against my ribs like a hammer. 32 years together. 32 years living beside him. Mrs. Hardin. Price placed a hand, heavy but gentle, on my shoulder, pulling me out of my daze. Have you ever given anyone a notarized power of attorney related to this house? Selling the house, signing papers, any transactions? No. I shook my head firmly. Of course not. I've never thought about selling. This is my home. I've lived here my whole life. Price looked at me, then asked slowly, as if trying not to shatter me, "And your husband, Lionel, could he?" I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. I stood frozen. Lionel, but he can't do anything without me. The house is completely in my name. In my name. In theory, yes, he can't and shouldn't, Price said, his voice low. But in reality, unfortunately, there are many ugly situations. Fraud, forged signatures, paperwork. We're going to check every real estate company across the counties. If this really is an appraiser, we'll find out who scheduled a nighttime inspection for your house. On the way out of Mrs. Halstead's house, I walked like a sleepwalker. My legs had no sensation. Everything around me was still snow, wind, and a gray, frigid morning. But in my head, there was only one frozen black and white frame stamped at 11:44. A car stopping in front of my house. A man opening my gate. A man stepping into my yard as if he had permission. And the most terrifying part wasn't that a stranger had come. It was the feeling that someone had arranged all of it in advance, and they were certain that this morning I would have no evidence left to call the police. If last night I had listened to Lionel and cleared the snow, then at this hour I would have erased with my own hands the only thing that could save me. Price gently held my elbow as we walked. "Mrs. Hardin, you need to sit down. I'll drive you home, then I'll start checking the companies." I nodded mechanically. He helped me into the patrol car. When we drove back toward my house, I looked through the window, at the footprints in the snow. The footprints I had kept intact because I hadn't shoveled, and involuntarily, Eunice's words rang out in my head, clear as a knock on bone. "When your husband leaves the house tonight, don't touch the snow," she knew. Somehow she knew that if I cleared the snow, the footprints would disappear, and with them, the only evidence of a plot aimed at me. The car stopped in front of my house. Price looked at me, his voice firm as a nail being driven in. "You should rest. I'll call as soon as I find anything. And don't worry, we're going to get to the bottom of this." I stepped into the house, took off my coat with trembling hands, walked into the kitchen, then stood still, staring at the wall as if it could answer me. 32 years. 32 years I cooked for him, waited for him, took care of him. And all that time, what was I? A wife? Or just something to endure? A burden? An obstacle? The phone rang. I looked at the screen. Lionel. My hand hovered over the answer button. Part of me wanted to pick up and ask him outright. Ask immediately. Ask until there was nothing left. Are you trying to sell the house? Where are you trying to throw me? But I didn't answer. I let it ring until it went silent. A minute later, a message came through. How are you? I made it. We'll talk tomorrow. Dry, brief, like always. I didn't reply. Because if this is the truth, if Lionel is really trying to sell my house without telling me, then 32 years of my life have been a lie. I couldn't sit inside the house for another minute. Every corner reminded me of Lionel. The chair he always sat in, the mug he always held when he drank coffee, the coat still hanging in the closet as if he'd only stepped out for a moment. 32 years of memories clung to every wall, every scent of old wood, every creak of the floorboards. I made a cup of tea but couldn't drink it. I sat down, then stood up again. I picked up a book, but the letters danced in front of my eyes like they were mocking me. In the end, all I could do was pace back and forth in the kitchen like a trapped animal waiting for the phone to ring. 2 hours crawled by like 2 days. Then finally, the phone did ring. Mrs. Harden, this is Price. The officer's voice came through the speaker, brief and firm. I found it. There are 3 companies in the vehicle database with logos that look similar. I called each one, and at the 3rd company, they confirmed, yes, their appraiser did go to Kinsman Road last night. My heart clenched as if someone had grabbed it. 1 beat, 2 beats, then it almost stopped entirely. The company is Hearthstone Realty, office downtown Cleveland near Public Square, Price continued. The director is Andre Whitmore. I arranged for us to meet him right now. Can you go? Yes. My voice sounded unfamiliar, like it wasn't mine. I'll be ready in 10 minutes. I changed clothes so fast I barely remembered what I did. The only dark sweater I owned, black slacks from my mother's funeral last year. I brushed my hair, then stood in front of the mirror. The face staring back at me looked older, more exhausted. Like in a single night, I had aged 10 years. Malcolm picked me up right on time. We drove downtown in silence. I stared out the window. Cleveland's familiar streets, the buildings I'd looked at my whole life, but today everything felt foreign, as if I were sitting in another city in another life. Mrs. Harden, Price finally spoke, breaking the silence. No matter what happens in this meeting, you need to know one thing. You did the right thing calling me. Many women in your situation stay silent out of fear, out of shame, but you didn't. I swallowed hard. I don't feel brave. I feel stupid. 32 years. And I didn't know. You're not stupid, Price said firmly. You trusted. Those are 2 different things. Hearthstone Realty's office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building near Public Square. We rode the elevator up in silence. Each floor passing felt like one more step toward the truth, a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face head on. At the reception desk sat a young woman with bright red nail polish. She looked at us with open curiosity when she saw the police uniform. We have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore, Price said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Yes, he's expecting you. She nodded quickly. Please go in. Andre Whitmore stood the moment we entered. A man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit, his face carrying worry covered by a layer of professional politeness. He knew trouble was standing right in front of his desk. Please, have a seat. He gestured to 2 leather chairs. How can I help you? Yesterday, your employee went to 17 Kinsman Road. Price began, taking out his badge. To appraise a house, we want the details. Whitmore frowned, opened a folder on his desk, and flipped quickly through it. 17 Kinsman. He stopped. Yes. Correct, there was an appraisal request for a detached house with land. Is there a problem? The problem is... I leaned forward. I tried to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. That house is mine. And I never called anyone to appraise it. Whitmore lifted his eyebrows, as if he didn't believe it. How could that be? The request was submitted under the owner's name. He turned the folder toward me. "Look here." I looked down. My eyes needed a moment to focus on the lines. Hardin, Lionel Michael, client owner. Hardin, Denise, owner. Power of attorney from the owner on file. What power of attorney? My voice cracked. I have never given any power of attorney. Whitmore blinked, genuinely confused. He flipped further, then pulled out another sheet. "Here, please." He slid the document toward me. A power of attorney from Denise Hardin, authorizing her husband to represent her interests in real estate transactions. Notarized. I snatched the paper. My name, my passport number, my address. Everything was correct. And at the bottom, my signature. My signature. But I had never signed it. Not once. "This is forged," I whispered. The room seemed to spin. "I have never signed this. Never." Price took the paper from my hands and read it carefully. His eyes darkened. "Mr. Whitmore," he asked, his voice heavier, "when was this power of attorney brought in?" "A week ago," Whitmore answered immediately, eager to prove cooperation. "Lionel Hardin came in person. He said he wanted to sell the house and requested the appraisal. We agreed on a time for the site visit. And you didn't verify the authenticity of the power of attorney?" Price stared straight at him. "It has a notary seal." Whitmore shifted in his chair. "Everything met the paperwork requirements. We're not required to verify every power of attorney through the notary board. That isn't our job. Show me all correspondence with the client." Price cut in, decisive. "Everything. Documents, contracts, emails." Whitmore nodded and opened his computer. "Here." He pointed as he spoke. "The first contact was 2 weeks ago. Lionel emailed asking about appraisal and selling. We arranged a meeting. He came in with the documents. We signed an appraisal contract. The appraiser went to inspect the house. At night," I cut in, my voice hollow, 11 at night, while I was sleeping. He walked around my house and looked into the windows." Whitmore spread his hands as if defending himself. "The client requested an evening time. He said someone was there during the day and he needed this to go unnoticed. We don't refuse if the request doesn't break the law." "So, working with forged documents doesn't break the law?" Price slammed his palm onto the desk. The sound cracked sharp in the room. Whitmore went pale. "I didn't know it was forged. I swear, everything looked legal. What's next?" Price nodded toward the computer screen. "After the appraisal." Whitmore swallowed. "After the appraisal, we produce a report. The house was valued at $420,000. Hardin agreed to that amount and asked us to find a buyer. We listed it." "When?" I interrupted, my heart stretched tight. "This morning," Whitmore said, "and we already got a response from a buyer, a serious man ready to pay cash immediately. We scheduled a meeting for the day after tomorrow to sign a preliminary agreement." The day after tomorrow. In 2 days, my house would be going from my hands. The house I had lived in for more than 30 years, the house my parents once lived in, every flower I planted, every corner I wiped clean, every season I endured. All of it could vanish with a single forged signature. "Where is that buyer now?" Price asked. "I don't know." Whitmore shook his head. He called, left a number, said the money was ready. He just wanted the deal fast. "I understand." Price wrote the number down. "Mr. Whitmore, this transaction must be canceled. We are opening a criminal case for fraud and document forgery." But my company has nothing to do with this." Whitmore sprang up, panicked. "We run an honest business. We were deceived." "We will investigate," Price said coldly. "For now, you will hand over the entire file to me, copies of all correspondence, and the appraiser's contact information." On the way out of the office, I don't remember how I made it through the door. I only remember Price's hand supporting my elbow and one sentence repeating inside my head, simple and merciless. A week ago. A week ago, Lionel came here. A week ago, he sat in this very room. A week ago, he handed over a paper with my name on it, with my signature. And through that entire week at home, he still drank coffee, still walked across the porch, still spoke to me in the same clipped sentences as always, like nothing had happened. I didn't know what was more terrifying, that he did this, or that he did it so calmly. Half an hour later, we stepped out of the office. I walked like I was dreaming, my legs numb. Price supported me and guided me into a nearby diner. "Mrs. Harden, you need to sit down," he said. "Let's go in here." We chose a table by the window. Price ordered sweetened tea for me and coffee for himself. I wrapped my hands around the hot cup, but I still couldn't warm up. The cold was inside, an ice that went straight through. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would he do this?" Price sighed, took a sip of coffee. "Money, Mrs. Harden. $420,000 isn't small. Clearly, Lionel needed it urgently, or he's decided to start a new life. But this is betrayal." My voice cracked. 32 years. "I've seen all kinds of things in this job." Price shook his head. "People change, or it's just that it's finally time for them to stop pretending." I took a sip of tea. The hot sweetness pulled me back into reality, helped me breathe a little deeper. "What do I do now?" "Now we go to the station," Price answered. "You'll file a complaint. I already gave them a heads up. They'll open a case file. We'll summon your husband for questioning. We'll request a signature analysis and check the notary. If we can prove forgery, and we will, Lionel will face prison time. Large-scale fraud." "Prison?" I repeated. The word sounded distant, almost absurd. My husband, the man I'd lived with for half my life, could go to prison. "And the house," I swallowed hard. "It's still mine, right?" "Of course." Price's voice was firm, like a stamp. "The transaction is invalid. The file is based on forged documents. The house is yours. No one can take it." I nodded. But inside me, a horrific emptiness was spreading like a crack in ice. The house would remain. But the life I thought I knew was over. 32 years. And if Lionel truly did all of this behind my back, then maybe he never loved me. Maybe from the beginning, he only needed a woman to care for the house, to cook, to wait. And now, he had decided it was enough. Time to take what he could take and walk away. And me, I was only an obstacle, a burden to be removed. We stayed at the police station for hours. I sat across from a cold table, writing the complaint with a hand that would not stop trembling. I had to tell everything from beginning to end. The footprints in the snow, the security footage, the car with the logo, the real estate company, the power of attorney bearing my signature. Officer Price stood beside me, adding each detail calmly and clearly, as if he were pinning every piece of evidence down to the tabletop so it couldn't blow away. The detective who took the case was a young woman, her face tired like someone who had grown used to seeing too many lives fall apart. She wrote nonstop, occasionally looking up at me and nodding. Finally, she set her pen down and said decisively, "We will summon your husband with a subpoena. When will he be back?" "He usually comes back after a week." I swallowed hard. "But I can call him. Tell him to come back earlier." "No." The detective shook her head immediately. "Don't warn him. Let him think everything is still going according to plan. That will make it easier to detain him." I nodded. My throat was dry and raw. In my head, there was only one sentence left. So it's real. I'm living inside a criminal case. When I stepped out of the station, it was fully dark. December in Cleveland, days so short you barely manage to draw one breath before night drops down. The cold wind cut across my skin like a thin knife. Malcolm Price walked me to the bus stop. "Hang in there," he said as we stood side by side under the pale yellow streetlight. "I know you feel terrible right now, but you did the right thing. Things like this can't be allowed to just pass." "Thank you," I said, taking his hand. "If it weren't for you—" "Come on." Price waved it off, his voice softening a little. "It's my job." You should thank the old lady who warned you about the snow. It really is like a miracle. I got on the bus, chose a seat by the window, and pressed my forehead against the freezing glass. In my mind, I saw the old woman's face, eyes that seemed to see straight through people, fingers dry but clamped like a vice. When your husband leaves the house, don't touch the snow. If last night I had obediently shoveled like Lionel ordered, the footprints would have been erased. I would never have known a stranger came into the yard. And by morning, fresh snow would have covered everything, wiping every trace clean as if nothing had ever happened. I would have kept living without knowing the house was being sold out from under me. And 2 days from now, Lionel might have called and said something as lightly as if it meant nothing. The house is sold. Or he might not have bothered to say anything at all, just disappeared with the money. And what could I have done? If the transaction had been completed, I would have had almost no way to prove anything. When I got home, I took off my coat, went straight into the kitchen, and sat down by the window. I stared out at the yard. Those footprints were now lightly dusted by a thin layer of new snow, but still clear enough to make me shudder. I knew I should eat something, but I couldn't swallow. Every thought of betrayal made my stomach roll, like it was about to come up. I felt only nausea. Nausea at how easily Lionel could decide to deceive me like that. 32 years. I cooked for him, washed for him, waited for him through long-haul trips. When he was sick, I was there. When he was tired, I stayed quiet. I kept comforting myself that Lionel was just a dry man, that the road had worn him down, made him exhausted and cold. But now I understood. He was only waiting for the moment to get rid of me. Sell the house, take the money, start a new life. I wondered, had he had someone else for a long time? A woman younger, prettier. And me, the old wife in Glenville, was just something in the way. Tears overflowed. I didn't wipe them away. I sat there and cried into the darkness beyond the window. I cried not because of Lionel. I cried because of myself. Because of the years I had lost. Because of the truth that I had spent half my life on a man who turned out to be a stranger. Because at 58, what I had left in my hands was a broken heart and memories stained by betrayal. The phone rang. Lionel's name lit up on the screen. I stared at the call for a long time, then pressed decline. A minute later, a message came through. "How is everything? I got here fine. We'll talk tomorrow." Dry, short. Like always, I didn't reply. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, rummaging through fragments of memory, trying to find the moment everything began to crack. Or had it been cracked from the beginning? Maybe Lionel never loved me. Maybe he married for convenience, needed a house, needed a woman to keep the fire going, to wait, to not ask too much. And now he had decided it was enough. Time to take what he could and leave. I remembered the wedding day. I was 26. He was 27. Lionel back then was tall, handsome, confident, and I was just an ordinary girl from Glenville, nothing special. When he proposed, I couldn't believe I was lucky enough for that. "You won't have to worry about anything," he said. "I'll take care of you." And I believed him. I gave up my dream of becoming a teacher. I didn't work. I stayed home, kept the house, waited for him to return from trips. The early years were truly good. He brought home flowers, told road stories, joked and laughed. We tried to have a child, but it didn't happen. When the doctor concluded I couldn't have children, something in Lionel changed. He became distant. Quieter, home less often. "It's okay," he said then. "We'll live with just the two of us." But I saw something else in his eyes. Disappointment. I couldn't give him what he wanted. I began blaming myself. Maybe I wasn't good enough, not pretty enough, not interesting enough. Maybe that was why he had gone cold. So I tried to please him in every way, cooking what he liked, keeping the house spotless, not complaining when he was gone month after month, not asking why he didn't touch me anymore, not demanding he spend time with me. I lived for him and forgot to live for myself. And in the darkness that night, I suddenly realized I had lost myself a long time ago. I wasn't Denise anymore. I was only Lionel's wife, only Harden. A shadow with no face of her own, and then a terrifying question rose up, more terrifying than the betrayal itself. If I'm no longer his wife, then who am I? And if I don't have this house, what do I have left? I want you to pause here for a beat. Just one beat. Because the most frightening thing is not that Lionel forged my signature, not that he called an appraiser at 11 at night, not that he tried to sell my house. The most frightening thing is that I realized I had lived too long inside a role. A woman taught that just endure and everything will be fine. That silence will keep the family together. That sacrifice is love. But when you sacrifice until you forget your own name, then when the truth comes crashing down, you don't just lose your husband, you lose yourself too. 2 days later, Malcolm Price called me very early. "Mrs. Harden, your husband is back. We detained him this morning when he arrived at the depot. The interrogation is underway." "Do you want to be present?" "No," I answered immediately, firmly. "I don't want to see him." "Understood," Price said. "Then I'll give you the main point. He confessed." My heart sank. "Confessed?" "Yes." Price's voice stayed even. "He said he's in debt. Gambling. He lost a large amount. The creditors threatened him. He decided to sell the house. He thought you wouldn't find out until it was too late. Gambling. Debt. So it wasn't another woman. Not because I had aged. Not because of my appearance. Just money. Just gambling. And his stupidity. But strangely, that didn't make me feel lighter. It felt even worse. Because at least if there had been another woman, I would have had a human explanation. But this, he simply sold our life for an addiction. "And now what?" I asked, my voice dry. "The case will go to court," Price replied. "With the confession and the fact that the sale didn't happen, it's likely he'll receive a suspended sentence or a short time, along with compensation for your emotional distress." "All right," I said quietly. "Thank you." I hung up. Gambling, debt, just money. But the result was the same. Lionel was willing to destroy me, to save himself. The trial moved quickly. Lionel received a 2-year suspended sentence, and he had to pay me $5,000 for emotional distress. The lawyer explained it was very difficult to get more. There was no actual financial loss. The transaction hadn't gone through. The house still belonged to me. In the courtroom, Lionel stared down at the floor. He didn't look up. He didn't apologize. I sat in the public seating looking at his back, the back I had once known as well as my own, and I felt only one thing: emptiness. Not anger, not heartbreak, just a hollow space frighteningly cold. I wondered, who is this man? I lived with him for 32 years, without knowing him at all. The divorce was finalized a month later. Lionel moved in with his brother and came to collect his things. I made sure not to be home. I went to a friend's house just to avoid having to see him. When I returned, the house was stripped bare. Half the closet gaped open with empty shelves. On the wall, there was a pale rectangle where his picture used to hang. I took down the other photos, put them into a box, and stored it in the attic. I didn't throw them away. After all, it was still a third of my life. But I didn't want to see them anymore. The first weeks after the divorce were strange. The silence in the house was deafening. No more doors slamming, no more a man's voice demanding dinner, no more grumbling. I walked through the rooms not knowing whether I should feel happy or cry. The neighbors supported me. Mrs. Bernice Halstead stopped by every day, bringing pastries and little bits of gossip as if she were trying to pull me out of a dark hole. The Petersons invited me over for tea. Price also came by a few times and asked simply, "Are you okay?" "You're strong, Mrs. Harden," he said once while drinking tea. "Not every woman your age would dare to start over, but you're doing it. What other choice do I have?" I gave a faint laugh, my voice drained of strength. Sit there and pity myself. Many people would do exactly that, Price said. But you won't. You persist. That's worth a great deal. But when night fell, when I was alone in the big empty house, I didn't feel strong at all. I felt lonely. I felt afraid. I felt lost. And the question returned, heavier than ever, who am I now? What will I do with the rest of my life? Spring arrived unexpectedly early. By the end of March, the snow melted within a few days, revealing dark, damp ground and the first green shoots of grass. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in my hand, looking out at the yard where, on one cold December night, a stranger's footprints had appeared. Those footprints had changed my entire life. I began thinking about work. Retirement was still far away. What would I live on? Compensation money and savings wouldn't last. I didn't want to sell the house. It was all I had left. At my age, the options were few. Sales clerk, cleaner, night security guard. The requirements were frightening. Under 45, work experience, computer skills. Where does a homemaker with 30 years of service go? In early April, I got lucky. The local library was looking for a library assistant. Part-time, modest pay, but close to home. I went to interview with the director, Nora, a pleasant woman around 60. Experience with books? She asked. No, but I read a lot. I love books, I said honestly. Reading had been my escape all those years. That's enough, Nora smiled. I need someone who loves books, not someone just marking time. Start Monday. The library turned out to be a quiet, cozy place, an old building with high ceilings, creaking parquet floors, rows of shelves, the smell of paper and comfort. The work wasn't difficult, but it was pleasant. I helped readers, shelved books, covered bindings. Gradually, I got to know the regulars. Women looking for romance novels, students with classics, young mothers with fairy tales, an elderly retired serviceman with history books. One of the frequent readers, Vivian, around 70, lingered at the desk one day. "Denise, dear, aren't you the one Bernice Halstead told me about?" she asked. "Mrs. Halstead, yes. We're neighbors. She told me your story, about the husband who tried to sell the house. It's terrible." I pressed my lips together. The gossip had spread through the neighborhood. That was in the winter. "It's over now. But it's good that you didn't endure it," Vivian said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I endured mine for 30 years, drinking, running around, raising his hand at me. I stayed silent, raised the kids. He died of cirrhosis 10 years ago. And only after he died did I understand how freely a person can live, without fear. You still have so much life ahead of you." Vivian began coming by more often, introducing me to other women, Lucille, Tammy, Zora, all around the same age, widowed or divorced. They gathered together, went to plays, visited exhibitions. "Join us," Lucille suggested. "Saturday, there's a retro music concert at the community center." "Let's relive our youth." I agreed. I hadn't gone anywhere in a long time. With Lionel, cultural life had ended 10 years earlier. He considered it a waste of time. The concert turned out to be lovely. Songs from my youth, the 70s and 80s. I listened to familiar melodies and felt something melt inside me. Nearby, my friends sang along, laughed, shared memories. After the concert, we went to a cafe, talking heart to heart. Everyone had her own difficult story. Lucille's husband left with a younger woman. Tammy's husband died at 45. Zora never married, devoting her life to work. "You know what I realized?" Tammy said. "Happiness isn't in men. It's inside us. If you have hobbies, friends, goals, you're happy. But if all your happiness is in your husband and he leaves, then that's it. Life is over." "Exactly," Zora nodded. "I've been alone my whole life. I live, work, go to the theater. Life is full." I listened and thought they were right. My whole life had been built around Lionel. His schedule, his desires, his moods. I had forgotten myself. Now I needed to remember who I was, what I loved, what I wanted. At home, I took out an old album. There I was at 20, a student at the teacher's college, dreaming of becoming a teacher, marriage, children that never came. No job, staying at home for 30 years. But there were dreams, to paint, to travel, to learn French. I postponed them for later, but now nothing was stopping me. I took a notebook and wrote, what do I want? 1. Learn to draw. 2. Go to the city museum. 3. Learn French. 4. Fix up the garden. 5. Find a hobby. The list was short, but it was a beginning. I smiled. For the first time in months, genuinely. The next day, I signed up for a drawing class at the community center. Classes were on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right on my days off. The instructor, Alice, welcomed me warmly. It's never too late to start, she said. The main thing is the desire. The first lessons were hard. My hands didn't obey. The lines were crooked. But I didn't give up. I practiced at home. By the end of April, I painted my first still life, apples in a vase. I hung it in the kitchen and felt proud every time I looked at it. In May, I decided to take a trip. A weekend getaway, buying a bus ticket to the state capitol, walking through museums, taking photos, feeling free and happy. One evening in early June, I sat on the porch with tea. The scent of blooming lilacs filled the air. I had planted 3 bushes in the spring. Bernice Halstead walked up to the gate. Denise, may I come in? Of course, come in. The neighbor sat down nearby. I wanted to ask, do you remember what the old woman said about the snow? I startled. How could I forget? I remember. Why? I tried to find her. She helped you, didn't she? I asked at the store. No one knows her. Jada said she saw her there once. Never again. That's strange, I thought. I've thought about her too. Maybe she was a guardian angel. Mrs. Halstead lowered her voice. How did she know about the snow? I smiled softly. I don't know. Maybe intuition. Or life experience. Or maybe fate. We sat until it grew dark. Then my neighbor left and I stayed, watching the stars, listening to the silence. Eunice Rowe. Who was she really? Why did she appear at exactly that moment? How did she know Lionel would tell me to clear the snow? I will never know. But I know one thing, she saved me, not only from losing the house, from a life of lies, from self-deception. I remembered her words. Your kindness will not be forgotten. It will return to you. I paid $1 for her groceries. And she repaid me with the truth, with a chance to begin again. Kindness creates kindness. The cycle never ends. I stood up and went inside. The house was no longer cold, no longer empty. It was warm with light, filled with new hope. On the wall, my painting of apples. On the shelf, French books. On the table, a flyer for next week's museum trip. This is my life now, not Lionel's, not anyone else's, mine. 58 is not the end. It is the beginning. I looked into the hallway mirror, the face looking back, slightly older with wrinkles, but the eyes were bright, alive. Full of life. Hello, Denise, I whispered to my reflection. It's good to see you again. And for the first time in many years, I truly believed it. Life goes on, new. Mine alone, real, and I am ready for it.